Have you ever been erased from something you helped create by the very person you trusted most? I still remember the sound of Ethan's voice when he slid the envelope across the desk. Calm, efficient, like this wasn't personal. You've become a drag on innovation, Noah. The board agrees we need to move forward. The desk between us wasn't just a piece of furniture. I had built it myself years ago from reclaimed Douglas fir, before sustainability became fashionable. Before venture, capital. Before our family name meant anything in the real estate world. 15 years of building Rains & Cohen from the ground up, managing our first mixed-use retrofit, negotiating solar contracts, running tenant engagement programs, reduced to a performance review and a printed letter. Ethan didn't even look up as I picked up the envelope. He had always been the face of the company. Confident, articulate, good on camera. I was the structure behind the curtain, the quiet engineer, the fixer. The one who stayed late. He called it a necessary pivot. But what he didn't know, what he'd overlooked in his rush to modernize, restructure, and claim sole control, was that 5 years earlier, I had started building something else, and that foundation was mine alone. My brother Ethan and I weren't just co-founders. We were, for a long time, partners in the truest sense, complementary opposites shaped by the same home, the same values, and the same loss. Our mother, Julia Rains, was the original visionary. She didn't inherit wealth or a Rolodex full of investors. What she had was intuition and grit. She started our family's real estate business with a single modest brownstone in Tacoma, Washington, converting it into energy-efficient apartments, before green building codes were even discussed in city council chambers. Ethan idolized her charisma. I clung to her work ethic. After she passed away from cancer when we were both in our 20s, Rains & Cohen's became her legacy and our shared mission. Or so I thought. From the beginning, our roles found themselves. Ethan could walk into a room full of funders and charm, them with polished pitches, storytelling, and that inherited spark. He was always talking about vision, disruption, ESG portfolios, and urban placemaking. It sounded grand, and most of the time it worked. People listened to him. They trusted him. Meanwhile, I stayed behind the scenes. While he was on flights to New York or Vancouver, I was in boiler rooms and on rooftops, ensuring our first properties met the green certification standards we'd promised. I negotiated with HVAC contractors, rewrote electrical blueprints to include solar redundancy, and trained our tenant services staff to track energy usage in real time. The kind of work that didn't make headlines or go viral on LinkedIn, but actually saved money and made life better for the people who lived in our buildings. We grew the company slowly but solidly. By year 7, we had 5 properties across Seattle, Portland, and Spokane, mixed-use spaces that blended commercial innovation with sustainable design. Our mother would have been proud. That was what mattered to me. Ethan, though, started aiming higher, flashier. He began using words like scalability and exit strategies. Our team of 20 grew to nearly 80. Investors came knocking. So did consultants. And with them came the beginning of the distance. At first, it was subtle. I'd find out about meetings I wasn't invited to, decisions made without input from operations. Budget approvals delayed or questioned, always under the guise of alignment or reassessment. Ethan assured me it was just part of growing pains, that he needed to focus on the big picture. But I could see what was happening. The more the company became about him, the more my role was redefined as a support function. Technical, necessary, but not strategic. Still, I stayed. Out of loyalty. Out of hope that the foundation we'd built together meant something more than market share. I trained the new hires, mentored interns, kept the lights on, literally and figuratively. I was proud of the work. I still believed in it. But Ethan's ambitions weren't slowing down. He started courting tech accelerators, pitching at climate summits, and drafting plans for national expansion. He surrounded himself with voices that echoed his own. Bright, driven, but dangerously detached from the messy realities of infrastructure and people. Our father, who had never been involved in the business, watched from a distance. I think he assumed we'd work it out, that brothers would figure it out on their own. But families don't break in one day. They fracture slowly, along pressure lines no one talks about. By the time I saw the termination letter, the split had already happened. It just hadn't been formalized yet, and what Ethan never asked, what he never even considered, was whether I'd prepared for this moment, whether in my own quiet way, I'd built something that couldn't be taken away. The day of the betrayal wasn't marked by shouting or confrontation. It was quieter than that, almost administrative. A calendar invite labeled Leadership Transition Discussion landed in my inbox 2 days before. I knew what it meant. I think I'd known for weeks. Still, some part of me hoped I was wrong, that maybe Ethan just wanted to restructure titles or delegate some of his growing responsibilities. But deep down I understood the pattern. This wasn't a conversation. It was a clean break, already decided. The meeting took place in what used to be our shared office, now redesigned with Scandinavian furniture, smart glass walls, and subtle lighting, the kind of space consultants love to Instagram. I sat down across from Ethan, who looked more like a venture partner than my brother. Crisp navy blazer, thin-rimmed glasses, a tablet already open with what I guessed was a script. No smile, no warmth. He began with a familiar tone, measured, practiced, vaguely apologetic. Noah, we're at a stage where the company needs to evolve. You've been a rock, truly, but our current model limits growth. The board believes it's time to bring in new operational leadership, someone with a fresh mindset. I nodded slowly, letting his words settle in. The board, in this case, meant him and 2 new advisory members he'd pushed through last quarter. Neither had been with us longer than 6 months. They were finance guys, the kind who talk about value creation but can't explain what. Insulation our values mean in a passive building. I've arranged a generous separation package, Ethan continued, tapping his screen. 18 months severance, full benefits for the rest of the year. We want to honor your contributions, Noah. I watched him, searching for any flicker of discomfort. There was none, not even when he told me my access would be revoked. By end of day. I see, I said simply. No hard feelings, I hope. He leaned back as if we'd just wrapped a casual strategy session. I looked past him, at the shelf where our mother's framed photo used to sit. It was gone now, replaced by abstract art and a 3D model of a building we hadn't even broken ground on. This is about control, isn't it? I asked quietly. Ethan's expression didn't change. This is about scaling a company that needs to be faster, leaner, and more competitive. You've been amazing at building foundations, Noah, but we're beyond that now. That line stayed with me. Beyond that. As if stable ground was no longer necessary, I left without ceremony. Packed up my laptop, my notebooks, a small plant I'd kept since our first office. No one from the executive team looked up. I passed by interns who didn't know who I was. The hallway felt unfamiliar. New walls, new paint, new faces. It was no longer ours. It was his. But what made it worse wasn't the firing. It was the timing. Just 2 months earlier, I had stepped in when Ethan's youngest daughter was hospitalized with asthma complications. I managed operations for 3 weeks, so he could be with her. He never said thank you. He probably thought that was just part of being family. That was the last illusion I let go of. Loyalty in business only holds if it's mutual. And I had been loyal, to a fault. I had assumed that blood, history, and shared grief meant something. In the boardroom, I had been wrong. Still, I didn't lash out. I didn't argue or beg. I left the building with everything I came in with. My integrity, my experience, and one key advantage Ethan had failed to recognize. I owned something more valuable than a title, and he was about to learn exactly what that meant. What Ethan never paused to ask, what he never thought to even suspect, was whether I had a plan of my own. Not out of revenge, not to compete, just to protect what mattered. And the truth was, I'd started laying the groundwork 5 years earlier, when I first noticed the cracks beneath the growth he was so proud of. It began during an annual audit. I was reviewing our asset sheet, just a routine check to make sure our leases and utility contracts were in order. That's when something stood out. All 5 of our most profitable buildings, our flagships in Seattle, Olympia, Spokane, Bend, and Eugene, were operating on land we didn't own. Our agreements were solid but short-sighted. Standard 20-year ground leases set decades ago with renewal options that looked deceptively stable. But when I dug deeper, I saw that the original property owners had either passed away or passed their holdings to third-party trusts and absentee heirs. In some cases, the families had no remaining connection to the communities at all. It struck me as a quiet but urgent vulnerability. If those landowners decided to sell or jack up the lease rates at renewal, we'd have no leverage. Our buildings, no matter how energy efficient or tenant loved, would be sitting on someone else's terms. And our operating costs could skyrocket overnight. I brought it up with Ethan over lunch, just the 2 of us, before consultants and expansion talk took over our time. I explained the risk, calmly, with spreadsheets and projected models. He listened. For a while, nodded occasionally, but I could see his attention drifting toward his phone. He brushed it off. "The landowners aren't business-minded," he said. "They'll renew. Besides, let's not get distracted from the pipeline. We're pitching the Portland Tech District next month." That was the last time I brought it up to him, but I couldn't ignore it. Instead, I started acting, quietly. Using my personal savings, along with a small inheritance from our mother's estate, I created a new holding company, NR Equity Group. Nothing flashy, just a plain corporate shell registered in Washington state. Over the course of 18 months, I negotiated directly with the families and trusts that owned the parcels beneath our top-performing buildings. Some were eager to sell older owners looking to simplify estates. Others needed convincing. I made sure the deals were clean, above board, and well-structured. I even kept the original lease terms in place for continuity. By the end of that process, I didn't just manage operations for Rains & Co. I owned the land under 5 of its most valuable assets. Even more quietly, I made a second move, less obvious but just as important. Our green buildings weren't just valuable for their rental income. They qualified for something else: renewable energy credits and carbon offsets, thanks to our solar infrastructure, heat recovery systems, and zero-waste initiatives. These credits were sellable in the open market or usable to qualify for federal incentives. I restructured the building infrastructure contracts so those credits weren't held directly by the operating company. Instead, they were assigned to the property owners, me. Ethan had approved those agreements without looking past the summary sheets. And why would he? I'd been the one to write those contracts after all. I didn't use any of this leverage. Not yet. It wasn't about payback. It was about insurance. I believed in what we'd built. I believed in protecting the people we employed, the communities we worked in, and the values our mother instilled in us. But I also knew Ethan's ambitions could outpace his caution, and someone had to make sure the foundation was strong enough to survive him. So I waited. I stayed in the background, managing tenants, solving problems, renewing permits, fixing the machine while he polished the logo. He saw me as operational support, an aging technician, replaceable. But when he cut me loose, when he erased 15 years with a single decision, he walked directly into the blind spot he'd created. Because the moment those lease renewals came due, and the green credit filings were audited, he wouldn't be negotiating with a stranger. He'd be negotiating with me. In the weeks that followed my quiet exit, I expected to feel bitterness, maybe even regret. Instead, what I felt was stillness. For the first time in years, no emails pinged my phone at 6 a.m., no late-night calls from facility managers needing emergency boiler permits, no last-minute contractor negotiations. I had space to think. I walked along Elliott Bay in the mornings, watched ferries slip into the fog. It was a strange kind of peace, but I knew it wouldn't last. 3 weeks after I left, I received a message from Kayla, one of our longtime property coordinators in Olympia. She didn't say much, just a short text. New protocols. Firing part-time cleaners, replacing waste vendor with cheaper outfit. Doesn't feel right. Thought you should know. I thanked her and didn't press. But the next day, another message came in. Then another. My former maintenance manager in Bend, Tomas, called and said his request for key equipment upgrades had been denied. Essential solar battery replacements were being re-evaluated, and his team had been slashed in half. They want us to cut monthly utility expenses by 20%, he told me. So they're limiting heating hours in common areas. We're already getting tenant complaints. This wasn't streamlining, it was sabotage disguised as efficiency. Ethan had brought in a so-called performance advisor, who, from what I could gather, had a background not in green architecture or community housing, but in franchise optimization. He came from the world of strip malls and chain gyms, not low-impact buildings in weather-sensitive climates. Then I heard from Melinda, a former intern I'd mentored years ago. She was now a licensed energy systems analyst working for a third-party compliance firm. She reached out cautiously, asking if I was still affiliated with Rains & Co. I'm auditing their lead compliance files, she explained, and I'm seeing red flags. Deferred maintenance, data inconsistencies, missing documentation. If they lose green status, those buildings won't qualify for 2030 clean build incentives. It hit harder than I expected. Not because I was shocked, but because I had fought for those certifications. I knew the hours it had taken to meet them. Now it was all being quietly undone in pursuit of short-term savings, or worse, a planned collapse. That suspicion was confirmed a few days later when I got an alert from a public business registry I still monitored for industry trends. A new company had filed articles of incorporation under the name Rains Urban Vision. The listed CEO? Ethan Rains. The business address was a co-working suite in Portland, 1 block from our flagship property. What's more, the project filings showed proposed developments targeting the same markets our most stable buildings were in. Bend, Olympia, Spokane. Renderings included modified floor plans nearly identical to ones I had personally designed years ago. Even the branding language was similar. Clean equity, community carbon, build better, live lighter. I called Patricia, my attorney. We spent an hour reviewing public documents, permits, and city filings. Ethan hadn't just fired me. He was repackaging our best assets, stripping them down, and preparing to present them as something entirely his. But that wasn't the full play. That night, while scanning financial databases, I found it. An early-stage funding pitch for Rains Urban Vision, hosted on a green tech investment forum. The deck claimed to be reclaiming community infrastructure and unlocking high-yield green retrofits by purchasing distressed buildings from legacy companies unable to meet new compliance mandates. Distressed buildings. He wasn't just neglecting our portfolio. He was trying to devalue it. The plan was clear now. Ethan intended to drive Rains & Coers into unsustainability by gutting its internal structure, then purchase the buildings back under his new company at a discount. Flip the narrative, clean slate, new cap table. But he forgot one thing: the land, the energy credits, the infrastructure filings. He was sabotaging the structure, but the foundation belonged to me, and soon, his entire house of cards would come face to face with reality. I didn't move immediately. I didn't send angry emails or hold a press conference. That wasn't my style, and it never had been. The kind of damage Ethan was orchestrating wasn't loud. It was strategic, calculated, disguised under layers of language like modernization and streamlining. If I wanted to expose what was happening, I'd need to do it just as strategically. No emotion, just facts. Because in business, proof is more powerful than anger. I began by assembling a quiet portfolio. Every deed, lease, and infrastructure contract connected to the 5 properties I owned. I pulled up clean title histories, renewable credit allocations, carbon certification documents, and construction specifications, showing which system components had been routed through NR Equity Group. Everything was dated, signed, and above board. Ethan hadn't read the fine print. I had counted on that. At the same time, I asked Patricia to review Rains & Co.'s latest filings. As expected, things were deteriorating fast. Their Q2 report had shown a 14% increase in operating expenses, with vague language around utility irregularities. Meanwhile, deferred maintenance complaints were rising, and their website had quietly removed 2 buildings from its featured list. Internally, I learned through former colleagues that morale had collapsed. Most of the longtime staff had either quit or were looking for exits. The glue was coming undone. Then the opening arrived. A certified letter from Rains & Kozer's legal department landed in my mailbox. It was a formal request for renegotiation of the land lease agreements. They claimed unanticipated shifts in operational burden and asked to explore revised terms for long-term sustainability. It was a nice way of asking for a discount. What they didn't realize was that I'd already prepared my answer. 3 days later, they received a detailed legal response from NR Equity Group. The lease terms would be renewed at current market rates as stipulated in the original agreement. There would be no concessions, no discounted extensions, no deferrals. The carbon credit allocations would remain in place as well, per contract. If Rains & Coers failed to meet lease terms, they would be considered in breach and subject to penalties, including potential repossession of property access rights. Within hours, Patricia received a phone call from Ethan's in-house counsel. That same night, Ethan showed up at my apartment. I hadn't seen him since the day he fired me. He didn't look like a CEO anymore. The sharp polish had faded. His tie was loose, the circles under his eyes darker than I remembered. "You could have come to me," he said. "We're family." I didn't invite him in. I just stood at the doorway. "We stopped being partners the day you prioritized funding over people," I said. "And you didn't come to me when you were cannibalizing the company we built." He tried to spin the conversation into a negotiation, talked about strategic misalignment and shared outcomes. I said nothing. I just handed him a manila folder. Inside were copies of the permit applications, business registrations, and investor pitch deck he'd filed under Rain's Urban Vision. His eyes didn't move. He already knew I knew. "You can't prove intent," he said eventually. "I don't need to," I replied. "You already did." The next morning, the Rains Encumbered Board received a special report compiled by my legal team. It detailed the full extent of Ethan's actions, his failure to disclose a competing interest, his deliberate operational sabotage, and his concealed attempt to repurchase the company's assets through a separate venture. It included every document he'd signed, every dollar moved, every regulation breached. The board was stunned. 2 members reached out to me directly within the day. One of them, Jonah Fields, a longtime investor and a friend of our mother's, called me personally. "Noah," he said, "did you really own the land all this time?" "Yes." "And the credits?" "Yes." He paused. "Then why didn't you stop him sooner?" "Because I was hoping I wouldn't have to," I said. Within a week, the board called an emergency meeting. I was invited, this time, not as an employee, but as a principal stakeholder. It took place in the same glass-walled conference room where I'd once been dismissed. Ethan sat at the head of the table, pale and silent. This time, his slides didn't work. His script didn't land, because the narrative had changed, and he no longer controlled it. I didn't need to make a speech. I just handed out folders. Inside was the full acquisition proposal from a respected green infrastructure fund, backed by multiple municipalities. The fund was ready to buy Rains & Co.'s remaining assets at fair market value and retain all current staff. The offer would also roll over any operating debts incurred during Ethan's mismanagement. I closed with one line. "Your choice is simple. Salvage what remains, or follow him off the cliff." The vote was nearly unanimous. Only Ethan abstained. He didn't speak again. Not during the meeting. Not when the board adjourned. Not when he walked out. He had played his hand, but I still held the foundation. After the board voted, the rest moved quickly. Clean, procedural, quiet. Ethan was asked to resign as CEO, effective immediately. An interim leadership team, composed of department heads who had weathered the storm, stepped in to stabilize operations. I stayed out of the spotlight. I didn't want a title or a press release, that was never the point. The acquisition deal with the Green Infrastructure Fund, Cascade Public Trust, was finalized within 6 weeks. They weren't just another holding company looking to flip assets. Their mission was long-term stewardship, equitable housing, environmental performance, and community ownership. The board had selected them unanimously after reviewing the alternatives, and I agreed to personally assist with the transition, but only behind the scenes. Each of the 5 properties I owned was folded into a renewable leaseback model. I maintained ownership of the land, but granted Cascade a 50-year operating lease with fixed escalation, capped rent, and a clause guaranteeing tenant protections. The carbon credits were transferred into a public trust, co-managed by a nonprofit focused on environmental equity in the Pacific Northwest. What Ethan had tried to turn into a leverage point, I turned into public good. Miguel, Thomas, Kayla, all the former staff who'd reached out to me, were rehired, with better pay, clearer contracts, and a seat at the table. One of the first moves Cascade made was to abolish the efficiency advisory group Ethan had hired. Instead, they reinstated regional management with autonomy and deep local experience. They asked me to stay on in a consulting capacity, helping train new operations leads. I agreed, but with one condition. I wouldn't be involved in executive decisions. I just wanted to focus on systems, performance, and people. The buildings began to recover. Energy costs stabilized. Maintenance schedules returned. LEED compliance was reestablished. Even the tenants noticed. Emails started coming in, thanking us for finally fixing the heat in Spokane, for restoring the rooftop garden in Bend, for resuming compost services in Olympia. It was the kind of quiet feedback that didn't trend online but meant something deeply human. As for Ethan, he disappeared from the company's narrative. The Rains Urban Vision brand never launched. According to filings, his remaining capital, partners withdrew funding shortly after the board documents were circulated. No lawsuits were filed. No public statements were made. Just silence. Our father called me a month later. We hadn't spoken since before the board meeting. He'd heard fragments from former colleagues and local press, but hadn't asked for details. When he finally did, his voice was lower than I remembered, more fragile. "I never thought it would come to this," he said. "It didn't have to," I replied. He sighed. "Do you hate him?" "No," I said honestly. "I just don't trust him, and trust is harder to rebuild than any structure." There was a long pause. "Your mother would have been proud of how you handled it," he said finally. "Of how you protected what she built." I thanked him, and we left it there. 1 year later, I stood on the rooftop of the Eugene property, now renamed Cedar Commons. The wind was crisp, the air clean. Below, families moved through the courtyard, kids laughing in the play area, tenants gathering for a weekend market organized by the community team. None of them knew my name, and that was exactly how I wanted it. Julian Hayes from Cascade joined me with a tablet in hand. "Energy usage is down 12% since we took over," he said, smiling. "And tenant satisfaction is at 91%. You did good work here, Noah." "I just kept the lights on," I replied. He looked at me for a long moment. "No, you kept the soul of it alive. That stayed with me." Ethan had seen buildings as assets. I had seen them as vessels, of memory, of community, of responsibility. When the weight of ambition cracked the frame, it was the foundation that held. And because I had protected that foundation, others could now build something better atop it. Justice didn't come with applause. It came with restoration, with continuity, with the right people in the right places, doing the work no one else sees, and that was enough. Success isn't about who talks the loudest in the boardroom. It's about who builds something strong enough to outlast short-term ambition. In business and in life, it's not the spotlight that makes you powerful. It's what you lay beneath it. Ethan thought leadership was about visibility, about making bold moves that looked impressive on a pitch deck. But real leadership? That's knowing where the pressure points are even when no one's looking. That's designing systems that protect not just profits, but people. It's not always glamorous. It's often quiet. But when the storm hits, those are the foundations that hold. I didn't win because I wanted revenge. I won because I never stopped caring about what we built. And when you protect what matters, for the right reasons, you don't just restore what was lost. You build something stronger. Have you ever seen quiet integrity outlast loud ambition? I'd love to hear your thoughts below. Stories, reflections, even moments you stayed silent and let the truth speak for itself. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing. We share real stories of power, justice, and the people who build legacies that last. Your voice matters here. Let's keep the conversation going.